Welcome back to the podcast where we dive deep into the human errors that changed everything. I'm Eckhard Jan and this is Error 1. This episode is about one of the worst oil disasters in recent history. 20th April 2010. The sun was just setting over the Gulf of Mexico. 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig floated quietly on the water. A marvel of modern engineering, a floating city 396 feet long, nearly as long as a football field and a half. It was built to do something few machines on Earth could do: drill for oil nearly a mile under the sea, through another 2 miles of rock. But on that night, something went very, very wrong. By 10 p.m. the rig would erupt into a fireball. 11 men would never come home, and over the next 87 days, the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America would bleed black, triggering one of the worst environmental disasters of all times. This is the story of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Why it was built, why we drilled exactly there, what exactly went wrong, and the human cost that still echoes through the oil-streaked waves of the Gulf. The effects of the disaster were devastating. Over 4 million barrels of oil contaminated the Gulf. The oil spill polluted the sea and killed countless animals, thousands of fish, birds, dolphins, and turtles. The pollution also had an impact on almost all coastal regions in the Gulf. The beaches were covered in oil, and many communities that lived from fishing and tourism were massively affected by the disaster. But what had happened? What led to this terrible environmental disaster? Let's take a look at the error chain again. British Petroleum (BP) was originally founded in England in 1909 as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company Limited. In 1935 it was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company Limited and thereafter renamed to British Petroleum Company, or BP for short, in 1954. BP was founded to develop lucrative oil fields in Iran and other countries in the Middle East. From the mid-60s, BP discovered gas and oil fields in the North Sea and later also in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. From the beginning of the 1990s, the situation changed for BP. The company was banned from the Middle East and Nigeria. Oil production in the North Sea and Alaska was expensive and profits were declining. In order to remain at the forefront of oil companies, bold decisions were needed. Consequently, BP continued its search for and development of oil fields in deeper waters. However, this was not without risk. Drilling in the seabed is fundamentally different from drilling on land. The deeper the oil fields lie beneath the sea and the oceans, the greater the challenge of tapping them. The water pressure at a depth of 5,000 feet is around 150 bar. A car tire usually has a pressure of 2.5 bars. In other words, the pressure at this depth is 60 times higher than that of a typical car tire, just to have a comparison. As you can see, the requirements for oil drilling at this depth are extremely high. But let's come back to Deepwater Horizon again. To fully understand the disaster, we have to rewind to the early 2000s. Oil prices were rising, the world's easy oil, the kind that you can reach with a land rig, was drying up. So oil companies began looking offshore. And not just offshore, but deep offshore, places where the ocean floor sits thousands of feet beneath the surface. BP, British Petroleum, had already been operating in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, for years. The Gulf was attractive, politically stable, relatively close to the US market, and most importantly, rich in oil. By 2010, BP discovered a new oil field in the Gulf. It was located almost 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The drilling well was named Macondo, ominously named the Well from Hell, by some crew members. It was about 10,000 feet below sea level and the deepest oil field ever found. Only a few oil production companies were prepared to take the risk and drill for oil so deep below the surface, but BP was determined to tap into it. To wrap up the job, it required a special kind of oil rig. In 2001, BP commissioned a rig from Transocean, the world's largest offshore drilling contractor. That rig would be called Deepwater Horizon. It cost over $350 million and was designed to operate in depth up to 30,000 feet. The Deepwater Horizon was one of the most modern oil drilling platforms of its time. Originally, it was not even supposed to drill at the Macondo oil field. Another large oil platform, the Marianas, had started work on the Macondo well in October. The drilling had already reached a depth of 5,000 feet below the sea surface. Yet there was still another 5,000 feet to go before the oil and gas reservoir had reached when Hurricane Ida severely damaged the Marianas platform. The Marianas was no longer operational and had to be replaced by the Deepwater Horizon at short notice. BP was already 6 weeks behind schedule and more than $58 million over budget at the Macondo well. With every day lost, it became more expensive. What no one knew was that a series of shortcuts, pressure, and missed warning signs were stacking up, like dry timber waiting for a spark. The biggest challenge for the crew was to secure the borehole. The gas and oil reservoir at the Macondo oil field was also under high pressure. It was therefore not possible to simply drill to the oil well. This only would have led to an uncontrolled escape of oil and gas. To prevent this, a so-called blowout preventer had to be installed in the borehole on the sea surface. In addition, the borehole at the seabed had to be secured with additional steel pipes. You have to imagine this as a double-walled steel pipe. To complete the drilling, the outer shell of the pipe was to be filled with concrete and secured in this way. Mind you, all this happened at a depth of several kilometers or miles down below the water surface, with correspondingly high water pressure, extremely high pressure. In the days leading up to the final securing of the borehole, the teams concentrated on the challenge of fastening the outer casing securely and correctly. Computer simulations were carried out specifically for this purpose. It turned out that at this depth, the borehole would have to be additionally secured with 21 stabilizers. These were ordered and hurriedly flown to the Deepwater Horizon by helicopter. Once there, it was discovered that they were the wrong stabilizers. The head of the drilling team was extremely annoyed. He did not want any further delays and demanded that only the 6 existing stabilizers were to be installed. Although the computer models of the experts demanded 21 stabilizers, the drilling manager got his way. Of course, it was not so easy to check whether the drilling and securing were successful at such depth. No one could dive down and check. As an alternative, there were various measuring methods to check the pressure, the backflow, and thus the tightness. The crew began with an overpressure test at noon on April 20th. They pressured the borehole. They observed whether the pressure remained constant or whether there was a leak. In further tests, the pressure was reduced to 0 and negative pressure was generated also to check whether the borehole was sealed from the outside. The first pressure test was successful. However, the negative pressure test yielded different results. One test showed a pressure of 0 bar as expected, but the test results were odd. They were confusing. Another measurement showed a pressure of 100 bar, which was far too high. The drilling team was puzzled. In the end, they agreed that it must be an anomaly, a blatant misjudgment, as it soon turned out. So the crew reported that the borehole had been successfully secured. The work was completed, or so they thought. An employee was still to observe whether there was any unusual behavior, such as kicks. This is the name given to the backflow of gas, oil and mud from the borehole. The problem with these kicks is again the high pressure. When gas rises uncontrollably from the well, the pressure decreases and the gas expands further and further. The more it expands, the faster it rises, until at some point it explodes on the surface. At around 9:01 p.m., the pressure on the drilling pipe slowly began to rise. Nobody noticed, not even the next few minutes. The pressure continued to rise. Then suddenly a pressure relief valve gave away. At 9:40 p.m., drilling mud sprayed out of the pipe on the deck of the Deepwater Horizon. Only now did the workers realize that there was a kick, this dangerous backflow. The oil sludge and gas mixture shot out of the derrick at rocket speed. Methane gas shot up the drilling column through the riser and onto the rig. It ignited. A fireball tore through the Deepwater Horizon. A witness later reported that it sounded like a 500-ton freight train crashing into the oil platform. The result was a highly dangerous blowout. The team desperately tried to activate the blowout preventer, without success. After the first explosion, crew members on the bridge tried to activate the rig's emergency shutdown system as a last resort. The system should have cut the pipes, sealed the borehole, and separated the drilling rig from the platform. As a maximum emergency procedure, the oil platform would have been completely disconnected from the well. But nothing happened. Although the indicators for the emergency system lit up, it was never disconnected. The Commission of Inquiry later suspected that the cables for the emergency shutdown had already been damaged in the first explosion. The separation sequence could not be started afterwards. The entire oil rig now vibrated. The gas had ignited in the meantime, and there were several explosions. The rig became an inferno. Finally, the evacuation command came. "Immediately to the lifeboats! This is not a drill! This is not a drill!"
The rig's flowing! The rig's flowing!
Andrea Fleitas, a 23-year-old bridge officer, sounded the distress signal, sending out an SOS. She said later in court that she had never been in such a dire situation in her entire life. Many crew members jumped 60 feet into the dark sea below. Others were trapped. 11 men, fathers, husbands, brothers. They would never be found. The Deepwater Horizon burned for another 24 hours before it sank to the ocean floor. Numerous workers were injured. 11 people were killed in the explosion, but that was just the beginning of the disaster. Without the rig to contain it, oil began gushing from the blowout preventer, a device designed to seal the well in an emergency, but it failed. The borehole on the seabed was damaged, and so the Gulf began to bleed. Day after day, barrel after barrel. In total, over 200 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Gulf over 87 days. The largest marine oil spill in history. Until it was finally possible to stop the leak at the borehole, several thousand feet below the surface. The effects of the oil spill were devastating. Beaches, coastal regions over a length of 1,300 miles and across 5 U.S. states were contaminated. A state of emergency was declared in the state of Louisiana. By the 1st of November 2010, helpers had collected over 8,000 birds, more than 1,000 turtles and 100 dolphins affected by the disaster. And these were only the obvious and found animals. Scientists believe that only a fraction of the animals were ever found. The number of animals actually contaminated was probably far, far higher. The environmental damage was monumental. The coastal economy, which was dependent on fishing and tourism, also suffered enormous losses. More than a third of the waters in the Gulf were closed to fishing. The health effects on the people who came into contact with the oil are still not yet fully known. I'll give you an example. Let me tell you about Kendra Arneson, a Louisiana fisherman's wife. Her family had been shrimping in the Gulf for generations, and after the spill, she said, the water turned from a source of life into something toxic. She testified before Congress, her voice shaking with emotion.
I watched children break out in rashes from the water. My husband would come home, coughing, covered in oil.
Fishermen found their nets coated in sludge instead of shrimp. Some simply left the industry altogether. And then there were the cleanup workers. Thousands were hired to skim oil, burn it, and disperse it with chemicals. Many were not given adequate protective gear. Years later, reports of respiratory issues, skin conditions, and worse started to emerge. So this wasn't just an environmental catastrophe, it was also a human disaster. But you might ask now, what was the error one? BP wanted to develop oil fields at depth where no company had ever ventured before. The safety precautions for this should have been much more restrictive than ever. The decisive moment, and in my view the error one, was the decision by the drilling manager to continue without additional stabilizers for a reason of time and cost. This wrong decision made the borehole unstable, resulting in the flowback and blowout. The error chain thereafter continued when the important pressure measurement was also misinterpreted. The Commission later came to the conclusion that the different values would have allowed only one conclusion: the borehole was not tight. BP had tried to save money in order to develop the oil well quickly. The fallout for the company was also catastrophic. Their stock price plummeted. The company lost more than $100 billion in market value in just few weeks. By the end of it all, BP had paid over $60 billion in fines, settlements, and cleanup costs. The US government launched multiple investigations. BP, Transocean, and Halliburton, which was by the way responsible for the cement job that failed, were all found to share the blame. The final report by the Presidential Commission was scathing. It said the disaster was a result of, I quote, systemic failures in risk management, not an isolated accident. BP's brand was shattered. It released apology ads. Remember those? We will make this right. But for many, those words rang hollow. BP was also banned from bidding for any oil production tenders in the United States. It took years for BP to recover financially. What remains is that BP's name will always be associated with the worst oil spill yet. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was supposed to be a wake-up call. Stricter offshore drilling regulations were introduced, but many have since been rolled back. Deepwater drilling continues today. Some lessons were learned, though, but others buried under bureaucracy and oil-soaked promises. We often think of disasters as isolated moments. Something breaks, people die, and the end. But they rarely are that simple. The Deepwater Horizon wasn't just a rig, or was a floating monument to our thirst for oil, for profit, for shortcuts. And when it failed, it didn't just pollute the sea. It revealed something darker and sinister beneath the surface. If you've ever eaten Gulf shrimp since 2010, swum in Louisiana waters, or watched dolphins play in Florida waves, this disaster touched you too. It's easy to forget, but maybe we shouldn't. And this has been Error 1, where small mistakes become disasters and the truth floats just beneath the surface. If you found today's story compelling, consider sharing it. And if you have a story about human error that changed everything, drop me a message. I'm always listening. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and see you next time.